delicious figs. Fresh figs are so delicious. Have you ever tasted one? But they're pretty hard to get a hold of. You've got to live in the right place because they don't ship very well. They go bad after just a couple of days. But you know, even dried figs are wonderful, and they're good for you. I just happen to have a few of them right here with me now today. How do those look? Pretty good? Yeah, yummy. I don't know if you've ever eaten. Have you ever eaten dates? Excuse me, have you ever eaten figs before? Right, you know, it's just a dried up fig. It's got the stem on the top of it. And then if you cut it up, here, let's cut one up. You see the seeds are on the inside. Can you see that? So that's the juicy, yummy part inside. Yeah, they're also tasty. Of course, it's not as good as fresh figs, but they're tasty and they're good for you. Now, when I was a kid, the only thing that we knew about figs was something called fig Newtons. Have you ever heard of those? Apparently they're not called fig Newtons anymore, just called Newtons nowadays. But that's all that we know. So it wasn't until I got to Israel that I tasted fresh figs. Wow, so good. This is a bunch that we bought on a recent trip to Israel with our daughter. And I'm sure you know what happened to them right after we took this picture, right? They were gone. They're so tasty and delicious. We couldn't stop eating them. When I was first a student in Israel, I didn't have the money to just buy, you know, containers of fruit like this. But you might remember that in the Bible, it permits eating fruit along the way as a snack. It's permitted. And so I did that. And I especially remember eating from a couple of small trees right on the side of the hill near my school that were growing wild there. Right down in there somewhere. And were they ever good? This is actually a picture of them. Now, unlike other fruit crops, the figs on a fig tree don't all ripen at the same time. They ripen at different times through a large part of the year. And what this means is that you can pick fresh, perfectly ripe fruit off of a tree almost every day or every couple of days, depending on how many trees you have and how big the trees are. And you can do this for a large part of the year. It's perfect, delicious, nutritious, and always available fruit. Sounds like a plan to me, a very clever plan of God. The Jewish rabbis put it this way. They said, why is the Torah, the Bible, compared to the fig tree? Because most fruit trees are harvested at one time, but the fig tree is harvested bit by bit. So it is with the Torah, with the Bible. Today one learns a bit and tomorrow a lot, for it cannot be learned in a year or two. So even here in the fact that you cannot harvest it all at once, but little by little, shows up in the teachings of the rabbis as well. So what that means is that you've got fresh figs available all the time through much of the year. So no wonder it was a common practice for everyone to have a fig tree beside their house. So in the Bible, every man under his vine and his fig tree is shorthand for a time of peace and prosperity. So here we see it in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 25. So Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So Dan was in the north, Beersheba in the south. The whole land was at peace because everybody was under his vine, everybody was under his fig tree. And that's also the way it's used in Micah's end-time prophecy about the Messianic age. In Micah chapter 4, verse 3, and he, that is, of course, the Messiah, will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again Well, they train for war, right? That's for sure got to be the Messianic age. And what does he say about that time? Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. So again, beautiful image of peace and prosperity. And Zechariah does the same thing when he is also talking about the days of the Messiah. In Zechariah 3, verse 10, "In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree." Wow, what a beautiful image. Just inviting your friends over, sit under your trees, and I'm sure eat little bits and pieces off of them, and just have a good time of fellowship, sharing together, talking together. That's life the way it should be. Well, not only do figs keep bearing delicious fruit month after month, they also provide lots and lots of dark shade. And this is because of their big leaves, the largest of any tree in Israel, bigger than your hand. And this is really important in the hot, dry summertime in Israel, where it gets really, really hot. The large size of these leaves explains why these leaves were used as clothing for Adam and Eve. Do you remember that? In Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, "And the eyes of the two of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made for themselves loin coverings." So they used the figs, probably because they're the biggest leaves. Now, all this shade from these big leaves made it a popular spot under a fig tree to sit in the heat of the day for prayer or for study, as rabbis would sometimes do when they were teaching their disciples. And this might be the meaning of Jesus' remark to Nathanael there in John chapter 1, verse 48, when he says, "While you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Because do you remember Nathanael's reaction? He had a big reaction to that. He said, "Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel." Why did that bring such a big reaction? Especially because we know that just a couple of minutes earlier, Nathanael was saying something kind of negative about Jesus, saying, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" You know. So what's actually going on here? Well, all that Jesus said in between was, "Look, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Well, that was a pretty good description of Nathanael. He was somebody who just said what he was thinking. But how did Jesus know what kind of person he was? They never met before. How did Jesus know him so well? And that's when Jesus said, "I saw you under the fig tree." So, in other words, Jesus didn't just notice that there was a person sitting there in the shade. He knew what was in Nathanael's heart, even at a distance. And he seems to have known all about his private conversation with Philip. And it's because he knew those things that Nathanael was led to confess Jesus as Messiah, the Son of God. Well, when the winter is over, the leaves of the fig tree first appear in around March or April. So, in other words, at Passover time. And this is later than the other trees put out their leaves. And this is the meaning of Jesus saying in Mark chapter 13, verses 28 and 29, about the time of his return. He said, "Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become soft and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the doors." So what is he talking about? He's talking about the time of his return. And he's saying when you see these things that he's been talking about, which if you read through that section, you know are the signs in the heavens, he's saying when you see them, it's just about to happen. Just like when you see the leaves of the fig tree, because they're the last ones to come out, when you see those leaves, you know that summer is just about to happen. So it's a symbol of something just about to happen. And Jesus is using it to talk about the time of his return. Well, the fruit of the first fruits of the fig appear at the same time as the first leaves. That is to say, in the springtime after the winter is over. But this is not yet the ripe fruit that everybody knows and loves. It's still green and hard. And so it has its own name, pagi. So apparently some people used to eat the pagi figs, though I wouldn't recommend it. They're bitter and tasteless. Probably you would have to be pretty poor to do that. But anyway, these pagi figs are the figs that the book of Revelation is talking about in Revelation chapter 6, verse 13, when it says, "And the stars of heaven fell to the earth as a fig tree throws its first ripe figs when shaken by a strong wind." So that's talking about those pagi figs, right? Now, this is not something that happens all the time, but every once in a while in April, when the last of the rainstorms of the season take place, a strong enough wind can come up and just tear off those pagi figs. And since they're still hard, they fall to the ground with a pop, pop, popping sound. So what is that talking about? Stars falling in that way. Well, of course, it's what even today we call shooting stars. And of course, usually they don't hit the ground with a bang. Usually they burn up in the atmosphere, but this is talking about a time when they're going to start hitting the earth in a much more regular way than what they do today. So in other words, this is one of the dramatic signs in the heavens that Jesus said would take place just before his return. Well, you might remember that Jesus himself had an encounter with a fig tree near Bethphage, on the backside of the Mount of Olives, near Jerusalem. And even the name of that village, which in Hebrew is Bet Pagi, means the house of the unripe fig. And so this tells us that there used to be a lot of fig trees here in the past. And in fact, there are still some growing here today. Now, to understand the story, we have to realize that this was all going on at Passover time in the spring. And in fact, it was just the day after Jesus rode on the donkey into Jerusalem on the day that Christians call Palm Sunday. So this was the very next morning. And since it was springtime, it was too early for the ripe figs. As Mark tells us directly in Mark chapter 11, verse 13, seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. So this is when Matthew tells us in Matthew 21, beginning with verse 18, "Now in the morning when he was returning to the city," he's going back into Jerusalem again, "he became hungry. And seeing a lone fig tree along the road, he came to it and found nothing in it except leaves alone. And he said to it, 'No longer will there be fruit from you ever.' And the fig tree dried up at once." Wow, what was that all about? Now remember, normally the early figs, those pagi figs, form at the same time as the leaves. When the leaves start coming back after the winter, you have the leaves and the pagi figs forming together at the same time. So since Jesus walked up to that tree and he saw leaves, there should also have been some of the pagim there, the little pagi figs. But he didn't see any. Now that, of course, means there's something wrong. This fig tree was not healthy or something. Certainly it was not fulfilling its created purpose. It was not doing what it was designed to do for whatever reason. And that's when Jesus cursed the tree. Well, does that mean he was angry because he didn't get a snack that morning? I don't think so. I think he chose that particular fig tree for a reason. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if he had noticed it the day before when he was going along the same road. He chose this tree to perform a prophetic act, or what we call an enacted parable, to teach his disciples an important lesson. And what was that lesson? Well, in the prophecies of the Old Testament, a fig without fruit was an image of calamity and of impending doom. As Jeremiah said about sinful Judah in Jeremiah chapter 8, I will surely bring them to an end, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine and no figs on the fig tree, and the leaf will wither, and what I have given them will pass away. So an image of destruction of the land because of its sin. Or as Micah put it in Micah chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, woe to me, for I've become like the gatherings of summer fruit, like the gleanings of a grape harvest. There is not a cluster of grapes to eat, a first ripe fig my soul desires. There's those first ripe figs. And what does he say about it? The godly one has perished from the land, and the upright among men is not. All of them lie in ambush for blood. They hunt each man his brother with a net. So obviously a lot of bad things are going on in the land. So that no figs could be found is talking about the righteous. No righteous people could be found. They had perished from the land. And this was Jesus' message too, that God's judgment was coming on Israel because of unrighteousness in the land. As Joel also put it, talking about an army invading the land again because of disobedience, he said, it has made my vine a waste and my fig tree splinters. That is this invading army. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become whites, destroyed everything. So destroyed fig trees as well as other plants are a symbol of judgment. And that judgment came because of people's disobedience of God. Now these unripe figs, these pagi figs, are also mentioned in the Song of Solomon, or some people call it the Song of Songs, as a symbol of the coming of spring. And if we read that, it says, the fig tree has made its unripe figs, that's the pagi figs, tasty, and the blossoming vines have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my companion, my fair one, and walk with me. What a beautiful picture of the coming of spring when it's so nice to go out and walk. It's no longer so cold like the wintertime. It's not yet so hot like the summertime. Just a beautiful poetic picture in this verse and in the verses around it. And of course, what it says about the figs is that the pagi, that hard, unripe fig, which is the first ones that grow in the springtime, that now they have ripened. And it describes this ripening process by saying that they have become tasty, or some people would translate it spicy, although I certainly wouldn't describe how a fig tastes as spicy, but it's kind of sweet. So anyway, ripening figs are here one of the beautiful signs of spring. So how does that happen? How do those hard and bitter tasting pagi figs become the delicious fruit of summer? Well, the way that figs ripen is one of the miracles of nature that point so clearly to a creator God. Because many varieties of figs cannot ripen without a little help. And they get that help in the form of a tiny little wasp known as the fig wasp. And you know, the figs need this wasp to survive, but at the same time, the wasp needs the fig to survive. This kind of mutual relationship is very hard to explain without seeing the creative hand of God at work. Well, anyway, what happens is that a female fig wasp crawls in, enters the fig through that tiny little hole you can see there at the bottom of the fig, known as an ostiole. And once she gets inside, she plants tiny little wasp larvae around as eggs. And while she's doing that, she brushes off the pollen that she collected at the last fig she was at, the pollen that's needed for the fig to ripen and to become delicious. And so she crawls in there and does her job. And then when the larvae mature inside there, there's both females and males, and the females, with the help of the males, leave the fig, and they now are ready to go to another fig and start the whole process all over again. Now this is a very short version. It's a much longer, more complex thing. The more you study about it, the more amazing it is. And in fact, it's amazing that this works at all. How could that possibly work in all those very specific details if it wasn't designed to work that way? So it's a very clear evidence of design in nature. Well, the earliest of the ripened figs, once they have become tasty or spicy, these are known in Hebrew as bakurot, the first ripe figs. This is what everybody's waiting for in the springtime, so they can have that sweet, delicious taste in their mouths again. And as a result, of course, these first ripe figs are very highly prized and priced as well. And, just as Israel was originally very highly prized by God. As it says in Hosea chapter 9, verse 10, like grapes in the desert, I found Israel. Do you find grapes in the desert? Not very often, so it's a very precious thing when you find them. Like a first ripe fig, there's that word, bikorah, in a fig tree at the beginning of its season. Those first ones are the ones that everybody's most excited about. So that is what Israel was to God originally, something precious, valuable that you really looked forward to. That's how he looked at Israel in their time in the desert. Well, the sweet flavor of the figs is mentioned in a parable by Jotham. I don't know if you remember Jotham's parable about the trees. And he says there in Judges chapter 9, verse 11, the fig tree said to them, will I leave my sweetness and my good produce and go to wave over the trees? Why would the fig tree want to rule over the trees when it has the very important job of making that sweet, sweet fruit? Of course, the answer to this is no, you go ahead and keep producing your delicious, sweet fruit. Don't stop doing that. Isaiah uses this first ripe fruit as a picture of the coming destruction of Samaria. Now, what was that? The city of Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And as it says there in Isaiah 28, verse 4, and the fading flower of its glorious beauty, which is at the head of the fertile valley, that's describing where the city of Samaria was located, it will be like a first ripe fig before summer that someone sees. While it's still in his hand, well, he swallows it, right? So just as people want and very quickly eat those first ripe figs, God is saying that's what it's going to be like for Samaria in its sin, that a larger, more powerful nation will come along and just swallow them up, just like somebody would swallow up one of those first ripe figs. And of course, this is what actually happened when the Assyrians came and conquered Samaria, as well as the whole of the northern kingdom. They were swallowed up and they disappeared as a nation, taken into exile to Assyria. But Assyria itself was not exempt from God's wrath. The prophet Nahum prophesied later that Nineveh, the great capital city of the Assyrians, would itself fall in the same way. In Nahum 3:12, all your fortifications, your battlements, your walls are fig trees with first ripe fruit. When shaken, they fall into the eater's mouth. So even Assyria itself would also be destroyed in the same way. And sure enough, that happened when the Babylonians destroyed them. So it was about 140 years after Nahum's prophecy that the prophet Jeremiah also spoke about these delicious first ripe figs. This was after the southern kingdom of Judah had been conquered by the Babylonians. And it's there in Jeremiah 24, verses 1 and 2. After Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and the officials of Judah with the craftsmen and smiths from Jerusalem, and had brought them to Babylon, the Lord showed me, so God is giving him a vision here. The Lord showed me, look, 2 baskets of figs set before the temple of the Lord. So they're sitting there in front of the temple like an offering or something. And he says, 1 basket had very good figs, like first ripe figs. There it is, bakurot, the first ripe figs, those ones that are the most anticipated, the most expensive, the tastiest, or at least everybody sure thinks of them as the tastiest. And the other basket had very bad figs, which could not be eaten due to rottenness. Okay, so that's the other problem with figs, is that they don't last very long. That's why they don't ship very well. They'll quickly go rotten after a couple of days. Well, after this introduction, God went on to tell him that the two different baskets of figs represented two different kinds of people. On one side, the exiles that had been taken to Babylon, God described them as the good figs that he would take care of and that he would protect. Whereas the bad figs were those who remained behind in Judah that he would then destroy. So why would figs go bad? Well, a lot of different reasons. The main one is that other things want to eat them too, like insects. And so as soon as that fig falls down, or if it splits open, something like that, things are going to try to get in there and eat it, and they will quickly rot away. And this is mentioned by Amos in chapter 4, verse 9. I smote you with scorching wind and mildew, and the caterpillar was devouring your many gardens and vineyards, fig trees and olive trees. So insects getting into the harvest there and destroying everything. Now, figs were so important a crop in Israel that they often became almost a symbol of the land. So, for example, when Moses describes the promised land, he says in Deuteronomy 8, verse 8, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. Now, in this verse, he is listing off the famous 7 species. These were the only species from which first fruits could be offered up in the temple in Jerusalem. And sure enough, if you remember when the spies went into the land, remember that before Israel actually invaded the land, they brought back different produce from the land. And what did they bring with them? It's in Numbers 13. They came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, a huge cluster, and they carried it on a pole between 2 men with some of the pomegranates and the figs. So these are the things that really caught their eye, and of course continued to do so even after they were in the land for good. But of course, since those figs can go bad so quickly, you either need to eat them right away or you need to dry them. And as a result, you can usually find dried figs in the market throughout the year. Often you'll see them wrapped up in a little circular pack like you see here in the photo. But you can also find them compressed, or we would say mashed together, to make I guess we'd call it a fig cake. It's called the devilah in Hebrew, or devalim in the plural. So it's just a whole bunch of figs all mashed together, crushed together. Another way to store the dried figs. Did I say dates again? The dried figs. So maybe you remember Abigail, who became the wife of King David. She brought David and his men 200 fig cakes while they were hiding out from King Saul in the desert. Do you remember that? It says, then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of wine and 5 sheep already prepared, in other words cooked, ready to eat, and 5 measures of roasted grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, devalim, and loaded them on donkeys and took them to David and his men. So that was very nice of her to do, to help them out in their time of need. And of course, she went on to become one of the wives of David. These cakes, these fig cakes, are also mentioned as gifts that were brought for the celebration when David was made king over all Israel. Do you remember that? They had a great celebration. In 1 Chronicles 12, verse 40, it says, moreover, those who were near to them, even as far as Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali, that's all the way to the north in Galilee, they brought food on donkeys, camels, mules, and on oxen, great quantities of flour cakes, fig cakes, there they are, devalim, and bunches of raisins, wine, oil, oxen, and sheep. There was joy indeed in Israel. I bet there was. That was a time of rejoicing. Now, these pressed together figs, this devalim, also had medical uses, medicinal uses. And so, for example, we find Isaiah using a cake of figs to heal Hezekiah from an illness. It's mentioned there in 2 Kings 20, verse 7. Isaiah said, "Take a cake of figs," that's a devalah, and they took it and laid it on the boil on King Hezekiah, and he recovered. So it's being used in a medicinal way, even way back in those days. And of course, today too, still, figs are used as a remedy for different kinds of illnesses. They seem to be most helpful with digestion problems, which is how fig Newtons were originally marketed when they were first being sold. But together with the leaves of the fig trees, they are said to even help lower blood pressure and help with diabetes. And the white milky sap of the fig tree is used against warts. And there's some other uses that are being investigated right now in different experiments to see if it really works or not. Certainly the ancient Romans knew about figs, and they thought that figs were a good food for somebody who was recovering from a sickness. In fact, Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD said that this was a good thing to use figs for. But of course, this was already known way back in the time of David. I don't know if you remember when David was living in Ziklag, his city there had been invaded, and they found a man there that had gone for 3 days without food or water. And one of the things they gave him to get him back into, good physical condition was a piece of a fig cake. It says there in 1 Samuel 30, verse 12, they gave him a piece of fig cake, devalah, and 2 clusters of raisins, and he ate, and his spirit revived. For he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So he was in bad shape. But these things quickly brought him back, and he was able to tell them everything he knew about the raid that had happened against David and the families of his men there in Ziklag. Well, it wasn't only the fruit and the leaves and the sap of the fig tree that people found useful. Its wood was also important. It was one of the very few types of wood that were preferred for the fires that were kept burning on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. So that's another use of the fig wood. Now, all this time, we've been talking about what's known as the common fig tree. But there is another type of fig mentioned in the Bible, the sycamore fig. But that's another topic for another time. Well, I hope this has made you hungry for figs and helps you better know what you're reading about when you read about figs in the Bible. We're hoping to put up some more videos about life in the Bible, so please stay tuned if you like this one. But in the meanwhile, as they say in Israel, beteyavon, enjoy your food. Enjoy your fig. That's good.